right, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. Most of you already know who I am, but for those few of you who may not, I'm Robert Bolton, and I'm a professor of political science and the National Security and Intelligence Departments here at Fairmont State University. And I just wanted to give you all a short, maybe 1 hour talk where we talk about the process of applying to law school. The first half hour or so will be my prepared remarks. I have an outline here. And then after that, I'll take some questions from all of you on any concerns or any issues I haven't covered. All right? So first of all, show of hands, how many of you are interested in applying for law school? And most of you, when you've looked at applying to law school, have you found much information online about it? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of what you read online is going to be inaccurate. Or at the very least, it's going to be outdated because, are we good here? Yeah, we are. Sorry. It'll be outdated because they made a lot of changes to the law school application process over the last, well, really since the pandemic, over the last 4 years. So let's talk about it. All of you are in undergrad, right? Okay. It's important to remember when you're applying for law school, there are 3 key things that any admissions office that is looking to admit a prospective student is going to consider. And I call it the 6-3-1 ratio. Okay? 60% of what they are going to consider when you're applying for law school is your LSAT score. Have any of you heard that term before, the law school admissions test? Okay. This is very similar to the SAT or the ACT for undergrad, the MCAT for medical school, or the GRE for many other graduate programs. The LSAT score is really the definitive deciding factor on where you're going to go to law school, how much money you'll be offered to go to that school, and, quite frankly, realistically, where you're probably even going to apply to. It comes on a 120 to 180 scale. And it's weighted so that the dead average for it is 150, or some years it's been 151. So that means approximately let's say in a given year, 80,000 people apply to law school or take the LSAT. 40,000 of them will do worse than scoring 150, and approximately 40,000 will do better than scoring 150. In reality, sometimes those numbers are skewed, but the average is expected to be right in that 150, 151 range. Okay? The second part, or the second factor that's going to come into play in an admissions office decision on who to admit, what type of scholarship money they're going to offer, is your GPA. Okay? This is probably roughly 1/3 of the consideration that they put in. If the LSAT is roughly 60%, if it's the lion's share of what they're going to consider, your GPA is your other most important score. So, if, for example, you have a GPA that is 3.5, 3.6, that's very good. Even at Harvard Law School, the average GPA on admission is something like 3.6. And you may say to yourself, well, not all schools are being equal. Maybe, for example, MIT or Stanford is going to, if you have a 3.5 there, that may be a bit more rigorous than, say, Frostburg State. And that's not me being derisive towards Frostburg State, if any of you are transfers from there or went there originally or have family members. But it is, they may assess that somewhat, but realistically, unless you're going to a school like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, MIT, one of those top 0.1% of the institutions in this country when it comes to undergraduate education, they're not going to have many points of reference for you. They're going to say, okay, you got a 3.8 GPA. That must mean that you're really committed to your schoolwork, you're generally intelligent, you're engaged. That will do well, even if maybe a 3.8 would be the equivalent of a 3.7 in another institution. So that I would still encourage you, yes, the LSAT is the most important factor, but having a good GPA is also important. Now, let's say you take the LSAT or your GPA, maybe because of high school credits or just in general you had a rough first year. Your GPA or your LSAT score is a little lower than where you ideally want it to be. Is that a deal breaker for you going to law school? Generally, no. Usually, if you have a pulse, there's at least one lowly law school out there that will admit you. There's probably a lower threshold. If you're scoring a 125 on the LSAT, next time just guess A on all of them, and you'll probably do better. But absent something unusual like that, I even have a friend, I'm not going to name him, who was very intelligent. He had something like a 3.8, a 3.9 when he graduated from here. But for some reason, he just couldn't really nail the LSAT. And he would usually score, he took it 2 or 3 times, and he scored something like a 143, a 141. Not a great score, to be honest. And again, this was a bright guy. He was extremely intelligent. He received multiple academic accolades when he was here, but for some reason he couldn't do the LSAT. He still ultimately got into a law school. Maybe he didn't have a scholarship. Maybe it wasn't Harvard Law, but he did get into law school. Same thing with your GPA. I would tell you, as long as you have a decent GPA, you're going to be okay. If your GPA is above 3.0, you're going to definitely get into some law school. If it's in the 2.0 range, it's going to be a little harder. You better hope that you did well on the LSAT, but that's still definitely doable. That is not a deal breaker by any means for you. Okay? Now, the last 10% of what comes into play when you're looking at applying to law school is what I call the personal story factor. What is compelling about you as an individual when it comes to getting into why the school would want to admit you? Now, obviously, if, say, your father is a multimillionaire and bought the law school a new library, I feel relatively confident you're going to get in. But if you're like me and your parents can't buy the university a new building, you better have a compelling narrative to yourself. So what are things that law schools look at that make you interesting? One thing that may be somewhat obvious and is currently in a state of flux based off of some recent Supreme Court rulings is certain demographic characteristics for you. Your race, your gender, your religion. I will tell you, for example, when I went to law school, I was the only student at my alma mater, Wake Forest University School of Law, in my graduating class who was from the state of West Virginia. And actually, I remember there was a girl, Shayla, who graduated a year ahead of me, and we became friends because she was the token West Virginian for her graduating class. Other things, for example, if you come from a single-parent household, if you are a veteran, if you have some compelling issue such as you suffered a traumatic incident like an injury, a bad car wreck, and you regained the ability to walk. And I'm not saying that to be flippant, but some type of very compelling story like that. Those can be very impressive. I remember one woman who wrote a book about the pharmaceutical industry, and it made nationwide press. It was reviewed in the New York Times, and she scored a 160 on the LSAT. Good, but usually not what would get you into Yale Law School. But because of that book that she published, she had a compelling narrative. So, for example, if you have a career, I've already alluded to if you were in the service, but let's say you worked as a journalist or you were a drug rehabilitation counselor. Those are all personal facts in your resume that may attract attention from the Law School Admissions Council. Okay? Now, we'll retouch on that in just a few minutes when we get to personal statements. But just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking of what's an interesting facet of myself. One last one I'll mention is in regard to your major. Just a brief show of hands here, or a brief polling. What's your major right now?
Education. Business management.
Okay, education, business management. I already know, but yet say it out loud.
NSI, poli-sci.
Okay, double major NSI, poli-sci, NSI, NSI, poli-sci. Okay. Yeah. So, and then criminal justice added on to the end. Something like that, your major can be very important. I remember I had another classmate who had gone to Washington and Lee University down in Virginia for her undergraduate career. And she was a classics major. She basically learned how to speak fluent Latin and Greek. I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. That alone isn't the reason she got into Wake Forest, but that is something that's compelling and certainly would attract my interest if I was reading your personal statement at the admissions office. The worst major you can get, though, when you're applying for law school, and I say this more for people who may be watching this recording later on than the people in the room, because Fairmont State does not have this major, is pre-law. Pre-law is the absolute worst major you can have if you're applying to law school. Why? Because someone who's in the admissions office is reading this and they say, okay, you studied for 4 years how to get into law school. What else is there about your personality that makes you interesting? There isn't really much diversity in your character with that, right? So I would tell anyone who's watching this, pre-law isn't really, again, I'm not saying that that's a disqualifier, but I would tell you look at something else. One of the people who's in this room right now is Clint Parker. Clint's talking about going to the seminary. Well, if you, Clint, were a theology studies major, say you went to Patrick Henry College, or after this you went to the seminary and you obtained your licentiate, that would be the type of thing that would be extremely compelling if you then applied for law school. That's something that's going to attract a lot of attention, especially if you go to a traditionally Catholic university such as Notre Dame Law School, something of that sort. Understand? Okay. Now, let's move into the actual taking the LSAT. The law school admissions test, like I said, is scored on a 120 to 180 basis. Can you walk in and take the LSAT with no preparation? Yeah, you can, but it's a really bad idea. When I applied for law school about 10 years ago, which seems like a lifetime ago now, they only offered the LSAT 4 times a year. Usually January, February, June, July, August, September, and then usually around October, November. From my understanding, in more recent years, they offer it 7 or 8 times a year. I believe 8 was the last time I looked it up. Also, when I went, you had to take it in person. Due to the pandemic, they allowed people to take it at their homes as long as the room was isolated, especially if you had a prior existing health condition or you had tested positive for COVID. I can't say for sure that those measures will remain in place indefinitely. So I encourage you to look carefully at where you're going to take the LSAT and whether or not you would want to do it at your home, or if you want to do it in a classroom at a university with other people. But keep that in mind, that quite frankly, the pandemic has really changed a lot of that. You'll see that it's changed applying for law school, it's changed taking classes in law school, and even taking the bar. It's changed the parameters of what you can do. But anyway, when you are applying for law school and taking the LSAT, I normally recommend you take it at least 1 year in advance of you graduating. So, for example, as I say this right now, it is November of 2023. If you wanted to enter the August of 2024 law school class, you would probably have wanted to take it ideally in June of 2023. You could still take it now. You could even take it as late as February, but I'll tell you why you don't want to do that in the next few minutes. If, however, let's say you're already a senior or you've already graduated, it's important to remember most law schools in this country only admit new students in the fall term. There are a few smaller, non-traditional law schools that offer night classes or allow you to enroll in the spring semester. But in the vast majority of schools, probably 80+%, you're either going to start at the beginning of the fall semester of the academic year, or you're going to have to wait another year to go to that institution. Do you understand that? Okay, great. So, if you already have a job, if you're already a senior, that's not a big deal. You can definitely still go to law school. But I would tell you that you're probably going to end up having to take a gap year. So depending on what time you take the LSAT, keep in mind you're looking towards the next academic year on when you're enrolling. And you want to also keep in mind in the meantime, you probably want to, if you're working, save up some money, because applying to law school, just like going to law school, is a very expensive endeavor. All right? Now, with all that being said, let's say you do the standard. You take your test in June of the year prior to when you're applying. What should you do preparing for the LSAT? It's important that you either enroll in some type of prep course or you acquire study books or some other type of online guide that can help you. In my case, I took the Kaplan test course. Kaplan helps prepare you for the LSAT. You would go to a classroom multiple times in a week. You would sit for roughly 4 hours, and an instructor would tell you, here are ways that you can improve your score on the LSAT. Many of these test prep courses offer you guarantees. You'll take an initial test, they'll give you an estimated LSAT score, and if you do not improve your score by X number of points, they will refund you your money. Make sure you read the fine print on those. As a lawyer, I can tell you, read the fine print always. But bear that in mind and think of doing that. You can also find a lot of really good books online. There's the LSAT Study Bible. They have sections for each of the 3 sections on the LSAT: logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension. And you can take different tests. For most people who are taking the LSAT, out of those 3 sections, logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension, logic games is the most challenging. Fortunately, logic games is also the one where you can, if you test poorly initially, it's easiest to learn how to do a logic game, because you think, okay, you will train your brain how to think and solve this particular problem. If I was going to make an analogy, think of solving a crossword puzzle. The first time you solve a crossword puzzle, it's probably a little intimidating, especially if no one's told you how to do that. But once you've been told how to do it, it becomes much easier, and with practice, you become much better at solving it. The type of test question that most people do best on, but which is hardest to learn the skills for, is reading comprehension. And that's not surprising. If you have a hard time reading in general, digesting text, you're going to have a hard time with reading comprehension. That's the one that's hardest to gain ground. Which also reminds me of one other thing. If you have certain types of learning impairments, such as dyslexia or ADHD, you can receive medical exemptions that will permit you additional time, and in some cases, unlimited time, in order to solve those questions. Okay? Just bear that in mind, but you'll need an actual doctor's note confirming that medical issue. Now, in regard to the LSAT, besides taking a prep course, I would recommend that you start studying well in advance. At the very least 2 or 3 months in advance. And if you know you're going to take it in June, honestly, if you have the opportunity, I would tell you start dipping your toes into the water 9 months or more beforehand. I don't think it's unreasonable to start prepping almost a year in advance. Again, most people do not do that.
The hardest I've ever seen Bobby apply himself to anything in his entire life was this.
Yes.
I mean, there were days it seemed like he was studying in a row.
So, and we'll talk a little bit. The only thing that's comparable in difficulty besides the LSAT stress-wise is taking the bar, because that determines whether or not you're going to be living in a van down by the river. So,
I forgot about it. I would say he even studied harder for the bar. I take it back. I'm sorry, but it was pretty close.
Yes, it was difficult. So, with all that in mind, when you come to look at how you're going to do on the LSAT, it really depends on how much effort you're willing to put into it. And the longer you study, the better you're going to do. Okay? Now, those three subjects, logical reasoning, logic games, and reading comprehension, there are actually 5 different sections on the LSAT. 2 of those will be the same subject. And then the 5th subject will be a test section that is actually ungraded, but they do not tell you what is the hypothetical test section. So you should assume every question you answer could potentially count towards your score. At the end, they will also give you the opportunity to fill out a brief essay. It's a relatively limited time of no more than an hour. And that's really just an opportunity for the law schools to get some idea of your thinking patterns and your ability to write under a restricted time setting. Now, once you take the LSAT, you wait. This is a stressful couple of weeks of your life. Usually you'll get your score back approximately 2 weeks after you take the LSAT. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but about 2 weeks. If you feel like you bombed the LSAT, you will usually have a window of a couple of days after the test where you can cancel your score without penalty. Okay? Now, one thing that has changed in recent years, and much like everything else I say in this, circumstances may vary. This is all in a state of flux. Every state bar, every school changes its standards some year by year. What may apply in what school does not apply in another. So please keep that in mind when you listen to this. When it comes to your LSAT score, some schools will accept your highest score. You can take the LSAT an unlimited number of times. I don't recommend doing that because that's a waste of money, but you can take it an unlimited number of times. Some schools will say, give us your highest score. Some will say, give us your top 2 or 3 scores. Some will say, give us all of your scores, which was the norm when I was applying to law school. And some will say, we'll merge some of them together so that we have the average. But it seems like based off of the conversations I've had in recent years, they usually say you can just submit your top score. That's usually what you can do. Those scores remain in existence for a couple of years. I believe it's 5 years after you take the LSAT. So that may have changed in recent years, but that was the way it was 10 years ago when I applied. So you get your LSAT score. Let's say it's a good score. Let's say it's about 160 or 165. Okay? Good. And so you start, now if it's a 180, you're going to Harvard Law on a full ride. Congratulations. But I look at the scores most years, and to be honest with you, if I remember right, 2 years ago when I was looking at it, I think the total number of people in the country who scored a 180 was less than a dozen. I think it was something like 5 or 6, but I know it was in the single digits. So you're probably not going to get a 180, but if you are, it's obviously because Professor Bolton was your instructor. That's what put you over. So, and Dr. Harris. And leave Bill out of here. So, But with that in mind, let's say you get a good score, 160, okay? You may already have a school in mind that you really want to go to. I have many students who come through my office and say, I definitely want to go to WVU. Their personal circumstances really are suggesting that. They have family in this area. They know that they want to practice. Oh, sorry, guys, just 1 second here. Need to make sure that I keep the meeting continue. Okay, good. Actually, I have more battery left than I thought. I'm pleasantly surprised by that. They will, some people know exactly what school they want to apply to, and that's the only school that they want to apply to. I don't recommend you do that. And there are a couple reasons why. One, you should always have a safety school. There's a ton of information online now that discusses, okay, the average score for WVU admissions is 145 to 153. You'll have roughly, that's the 25 percentile range and the 75 percentile range. The average student at WVU is going to be between those two. Okay, the majority of their students will be within that 145 to 153 range. Okay, pretty simple to understand. If you know what your LSAT score is, you should always apply to at least one school well below or well within the range of that number, okay? Because that makes it highly likely that you are going to gain admission and that you will receive some type of scholarship, okay? And this is important because let's say you're applying to schools and you have two schools. One of them offers you a very good scholarship. I'll use this as my own life experience as an example. I did fairly well in the LSAT, and I was offered a full ride to WVU Law School. I was able to take that scholarship offer and present it to other schools I was interested in applying to and saying, okay, you've admitted me and offered me, let's say, $5,000 in scholarship money. Can you do better? It's basically a bargaining chip. So that's why you should apply to multiple schools, so you have some type of bargaining chip. We'll also talk about application fees in a minute. The other reason is, and I don't mean this nightmare scenario to terrify you, you may not get into your desired school. There were a couple schools I applied to. I applied to 19, and out of those 19, I got into 15. But there were 4 that I didn't get into. I was waitlisted at UVA. That was kind of my dream school. It was close to home. It was a top 14 school. I was waitlisted, but ultimately I didn't get in. Stinks for me, but that's life, right? So, bear that in mind. Apply to multiple schools. When you're applying, most schools have an application fee. When I was in applying to school, it was between $25 and $100. 25 or 50 was the norm, and 100 was your high top 14 schools in the country. It's gone up since then, but the good thing is you can usually email the admissions office at that school and say, hey, I'm interested in applying to your school. Can you give me a fee waiver? Either because I'm from a single parent home, my parents are middle class or lower middle class, I'm a starving college student. Turn on the waterworks, okay? Say you've had a really strong interest in applying to Thomas Cooley Law School for years. That's been your dream school, but you just can't afford it. They'll usually give you a fee waiver. Not always, but usually they will. The other thing I would mention in regard to applying to law school is the processing form for your application will be handled by an organization called the Law School Admissions Council, LSAC, L-S-A-C. As long as you are going to an ABA accredited school, the LSAC will be managing your application. They will compile your cover letter, or I should say personal statement, your LSAT score. They will process all that and submit it electronically. You can do it in paper, but there'd be no reason to do that. When you look at these application fees, the fee for the LSAT, the prep courses, paying LSAT, you're looking at least a couple of $100. And more likely, especially if you're using the prep course, you're looking at a few $1,000s. One last thing I would tell you before we move into your personal statements to bear in mind when it comes to applying to law school is when you apply to certain schools, you want to make sure, if possible, it's a school you feel very strongly about, that you try and make an on-campus visit. You actually show up at the school and say, hey, I'd like to meet the dean. I'd like to meet the admissions office. I'd like to meet some of your prominent professors. Do your research beforehand also. Because if the dean of the law school says, boy, I met that Nathan Bolton guy. He seems like a real go-getter. They'll put in a good word with the admissions office, and it makes it more likely that you will be admitted or get a good scholarship. Okay? Now, so just bear that in mind. And I would tell you, if I'm being fully honest with you, if I was you, for you and your families, I would probably expect you need to have somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000 squirreled away for the whole kit and caboodle. It's an expensive process, but if you do this right, you can save yourself a ton of money in the long term when it comes to scholarships, reduced tuition, etc. Okay? Now, when it comes to your personal statements, along with your LSAT score and your GPA, this is your opportunity for the school to know about you and learn what's compelling about you. It's important you avoid certain tropes. For example, it is common in West Virginia in recent years, we've used what I call the hillbilly elegy essay. I come from Appalachia. It's an impoverished area. It's a coal mining community. There are tons of people in my community addicted to heroin. I've seen that the criminal justice system is failing them. Nobody wants to hear that. Every admissions counselor has read that essay 1,000 times before you, from people from Southern Ohio, Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, West Virginia, Southern Pennsylvania. They've heard it before. Come up with something different. I have one former student of mine named Greg, who is an Iraq war vet. Bill probably knows the one I'm referring to. I helped him when he was applying for law school, and what he talked about in his personal statement was, I was in Iraq and I saw the breakdown of civil society in this country. This is a place where the rule of law has never meaningfully existed. And to the extent it did exist before 2003, afterwards it was a brutal civil war where the idea of individual liberties, the right to vote, religious freedom, totally went out the window. That's a compelling essay. I've had other students who have unfortunately been the victims of crime and talked about how that impacted their life. That's impressive. I have had students who have worked in the legal system, say worked at a law firm during the summer or doing a part-time job. That's a compelling one. Or they did an internship in a prosecutor's office. Again, that works. That shows that you've cut your teeth a little bit in the trenches. They're interested in that. Those are all good ones. What I tell people is a personal statement by itself, if you have a terrible LSAT and GPA, will not get you into law school. But if you have two students who are both, let's say, at 155 in their LSAT, one of them has a really compelling personal story and the other gave a very bland personal statement, they're going to admit the person who has the compelling narrative. Same thing, maybe you're a little on the low end of what they normally admit, but you really knocked it out of the park. You were really dam busters when it came to the quality of your personal statement. They may take a chance to let you in. Okay? Last thing I'll mention about your personal statement. 2 pages exactly. No more, no less. If they say it's 2 pages, you need to make sure it is exactly 2 pages. Do not submit like you would in a college class essay where it's 4 pages. You don't give 3 pages and then 2 sentences on the 4th page. Make sure it's a full 2 pages. Also, do not run over. So when I was there, you better believe I was blocking, I was tinkering with the margins, I was doing 11.5 font. But make sure you follow their guidelines. You're exactly in compliance. If they give you a longer personal statement, great, do so. But very few law schools do. It's standard to have 2 pages. Last thing about this, letter of recommendation. Do not ask your local congressman to write you a letter of recommendation. Unless you clerked for that guy, you worked the summer in his office and he knew you personally, don't do that. Most schools require you have 3 letters of recommendation. 2 of them should be from faculty members. And again, it shouldn't be a faculty member you only had for 1 class. It should be someone such as your advisor, someone you had in multiple classes, someone who knows you personally and can attest, boy, this is a great student. He or she is a real go-getter. Can give them, again, think of it as like a personal statement plus. They can flesh out who you are from a different through a different set of eyes. Okay? Your 3rd statement, that really depends. Most people use a 3rd professor, which is perfectly fine. If you have some personal aspect of yourself, though, that's really compelling, for example, if you were in the military, you're a staff sergeant. If you're studying for the seminary, the priest who inaugurated you into, your particular religious order, something of that sort would be compelling. But most of the time, people have 3 personal statements from their professors. Again, I would avoid your normal day-to-day preacher. If it's just someone you go to church with, avoid that. If it's your parents or another relative, avoid that. If it is a well-known public figure whom you have not worked with or had meaningful involvement, avoid that. All right? Now, just a few more things before we wrap it up, and then I start taking questions. When you look at, after having your personal statement, after you have your, one last thing I should mention about letters of recommendation. Technically, they are submitted directly to the Law School Admissions Council, but in an ideal scenario, your letter of recommendation will be provided to you by the writer beforehand, okay? I'm not saying that it necessarily means you'll get a bad letter otherwise, but you want to make sure that there aren't any inaccurate statements, or quite frankly, it was a very apathetic letter. You don't want something like that. You want a good letter, okay? Give me just 1 second, folks, to make sure that my computer is not about to die. Okay, and it is. So, Nathan, could you kind of change your spots for just a second?
All right, this is where I speak. Yeah.
So, just a moment, everyone. My apologies. Okay, and we're back. Okay, so the last thing I would mention concerning this is you've got your personal statement, you've got your letters of recommendation, you have your LSAT score. You're looking at schools to apply to. Now, the best schools in the country are known as top 14 law schools. Okay, this is your Harvard, Yale, UVA, Chicago, Vanderbilt, and I'd have to look through the list, but those are the top 14. Those are pretty static. They almost never change. Below that, you have what encompasses both the top 14 and roughly the top, I'd say, 50 law schools in the country. These are tier 1 schools. These are if the top 14 are the creme de la creme, the tier 1 schools are the cream of the crop. Then tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4, it's roughly every 50. There are approximately 200 law schools in the country. Roughly every 50 break down to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. I'm going to be honest with you all. When you are looking at where to apply to law school, if you get into Harvard and you get no scholarship money whatsoever, but you get a full ride to, say, University of Pittsburgh Law School. Go to freaking Harvard, all right? You will be taken care of for the rest of your life. You will go into any law firm and immediately get offered a job, okay? If you're in one of those top 14, that's a different kettle of fish. Those are schools you should definitely take, even if they offer you no money. But outside of that, you need to weigh what schools are offering you scholarship-wise and your personal circumstances, okay? One other thing I should also mention before we go further, if you take the LSAT in June, you'll get it roughly in 2 weeks. The first day to apply to law school is traditionally October 1st of each year. Ideally, you want to have everything ready by then, okay? Because many schools do rolling admissions. I remember when I was applying to law school, William and Mary, for example, did that, which means they say, okay, we've got 150 seats. As they come in, as we have applicants who are compelling, we admit them. And once that 150 is full, absent unusual circumstances or someone rejecting our offer, those seats are gone. Tough luck. Have a nice life. Okay? So have your application ready by October 1st if at all possible. Have everything ready so October 1st you can submit your applications. You can take the LSAT for the year you're applying as late as February of that year, but I really don't recommend that because most law schools usually close their admissions by about March, usually no later than April. Some schools do even later than that. I think the latest I've ever seen was June, but you don't want to do that, okay? You want to have it ready as soon as possible so you have more time to visit campus if you're being considered. You have more time to decide which schools you want to go to. When you're looking at what schools, let's say you applied to 15 schools, and let's say you were admitted to 10 of them, waitlisted at 3, and rejected at 2. If you're rejected from the 2, you're not going to get in. You could theoretically send an email and request for reconsideration, but they're not going to reconsider. I've never heard of that happening. If you're waitlisted, there's probably a 50-50 chance you're going to get in, but you're not going to get any scholarship money. It's highly unlikely you'll get any scholarship money. So you probably want to look at those remaining 10 schools that you were outright admitted to. What are the things you should look at? One is the quality of the school. That should not be the only thing, though. Don't focus solely on the ranking. I'll tell you my personal story in just a minute why that's a bad idea. You also want to look at what schools offer you money, how close they are to your family or your personal situation, and whether or not you think this campus, and again, this comes about by visiting it, you think this will be a good environment for you. Okay? So I'll give you the example of myself. I applied to multiple schools, and as the process went through, I slowly winnowed out the schools I applied to. I applied to WVU and Syracuse's safety schools. I told you I got waitlisted at UVA. I applied to Case Western, which was a school recommended to me by one of my professors here. And depending on what school I went to, I usually received a decent amount of money. Once or twice you'll encounter a school that'll be well below your rank, your average score for your LSAT. They won't offer you any money. They do that because they know it's highly unlikely that you're actually going to go there. And they basically are saying, we'll let you in on the off chance you do decide to come here, but we're not wasting time and potential dollars on you when we have someone who's a more likely candidate. So the last 2 schools I finally had winnowed myself down to were the University of Iowa and Wake Forest University. At that time, they're both Tier 1 schools. Wake Forest was ranked something like roughly, I want to say 34th in the country, 31st, 34th, something like that. And Iowa was in the low 20s. I think it was about 10 spots higher, 20, 21, maybe 22 or 23. I thought to myself, gee, because again, I didn't really have many people who could guide me. I had what I could find on the internet, consulting with people who I knew were lawyers, but again, most of them had graduated years prior, so it was hard to determine. I'm looking at U.S. News and World Report. I say, geez, Iowa's ranked 10 spots higher than Wake Forest. But Iowa didn't offer me a single dollar. And I asked them, and they basically stonewalled me and said, no, sorry, we're not giving you any money. Tough luck. Wake Forest, on the other hand, offered me a 50% tuition scholarship. You're talking tens of thousands of dollars. I said to myself, well, gee whiz, I can go to WVU, full ride, it's close to home. I didn't really want to go to WVU. I'd lived out of state for a couple of years in my youth, but I'd lived in West Virginia the vast majority of my life. I did want a change of scenery for a little while. So I didn't think I was going to go to WVU. Wake Forest, it's a 4.5-hour drive, and they're offering me a decent amount of money, and they're pretty highly ranked. They're in that tier 1, which is kind of the goal I'd set myself for getting into. Or I could go to Iowa, which was higher ranked, but I'd get no money. It's an 11-hour drive from Grafton, West Virginia, and half the year I'm in a field of corn, and the other half of the year I'm in a field of snow. So can you guess which one I went to? Which one do you think I went to? Wake Forest. And you know what happened the very next year? Iowa dropped about 10 places, and Wake Forest went up about 10 places. Because, surprise, the rankings are very fluid. Right? Wake Forest, I think, is 19 in the country right now. Now, I don't say that to go toot, but I use that for the illustrative purpose of those rankings can change. Even 1 or 2 of the top 14 schools have changed. Harvard and Yale have shifted. I think last year Stanford was ranked highest, or a couple years ago it was. And then I think Vanderbilt dropped down to 15 out of the top 14, which was a cataclysmic shift. So I tell you, look at who's offering you money. Visit the campus. Say to yourself, is this a place I'd want to live for 3 years? Because again, it's not just all law school. You won't have a life. You're in law school, especially that first year. But even though you're in grad school, you will have an environment you're living in. Is this a place where you feel safe living? Is this somewhere that's affordable? Where is this ranked? Does it have name recognition? What's the faculty like? Are they pretty prestigious? And that leads to my last point. After you've been admitted to law school, you need to start looking at what you're going to do when you are in law school. Okay? I've had some students ask me, well, what's the standard course of study? Assuming you're like 90% of people where you're not doing night school, you're not doing weekend courses. Some schools like Tom Cooley offer that, but let's assume you're doing your standard traditional course of study. It's going to be 3 years. 6 semesters. You can take some extra courses during the summer. I have a friend, Scott, who did that, and he graduated a semester early, which gave him more time to study for the bar or get out into the work world quicker. And a few schools like Northwestern allow you to graduate a full year early, but you still have to pay 3 years worth of tuition. They're going to get their money no matter what. Last thing I'll mention in regard to that is you can also, in many schools nowadays, do joint degrees. I'm seeing some schools, for example, Harvard has did this for years. You all know who Mitt Romney is, right? Wake Forest does this as well. They have dual degrees where you can get your JD and your MBA. Mitt Romney, when he went to Harvard, earned both his JD and his MBA. He never practiced law, but he could take the bar today if he wanted to. Your first year at law school, your course of study will be assigned for you. You don't get to pick your classes, especially your first semester. Each school is a little different, but your first semester, they're saying to you, you're in this section, you're taking these courses. Have fun, here's your professor. You don't get to pick. You also may say to yourself, well, do I get to specialize in what type of law I want to do? No. Everyone gets the same degree. You all get a JD, a Juris Doctor. Now, let's say you have an interest in a particular subject, international law, for example. You may look at the programs. Case Western, for example, has a phenomenal international law program. One of our faculty members here, Dr. Greg Noon, is very good friends with the dean there. And you say to yourself, well, geez, I'd like to maybe eventually do international law, or I want to become a JAG. Well, you might want to look at that school and potentially apply there, but you're not going to be a JD specializing in international law. You'll just have a JD and you happen to take additional courses that specialize in international law or with professors who specialize in that subject. WVU, for example, has a really strong program, probably one of the strongest in the country besides the University of Texas, in coal, oil, and gas. They had one of the first energy law programs in the country. That would be something to consider. Out west, they have a lot of specialties at schools like Montana and Colorado that specialize in water law. Understand? Same thing, some schools specialize in, say, criminal justice. So it all depends on what you're interested in, but that first year, you're going to have the classes decided for you. You do not get much in the way of decision making on that issue. And then after that, get ready for the most miserable 3 years of your life. And then after that, there is hope. You get to take the bar, which is the most miserable 2 days of your life. And then after that, you go on and practice law, and then you die. So, no, I'm joking. Well, you do die eventually, but no, I will say this much about the law. Law school is stressful. Your first year especially is stressful. There's an old phrase, scare you to death, work you to death, bore you to death. Those describe consecutively your 3 years in law school. And the bar was tough, what my brother alluded to. Right before I took the bar, the week prior, my family went to Virginia Beach, and I stayed at home. I'm not kidding you when I say I literally studied 15 hours a day. I briefly showered, I briefly ate, and I slept for 7 to 8 hours, and the rest of the time I was studying. And that's why I passed the first time. It was a tough challenge. It was a 2-day course. They're actually starting to tinker with that, how long the bar is and what subjects are being tested. But it's right now a 2-day course. Then I had to wait 5 weeks past, thankfully, and I started practicing law after I was sworn in October 14th, 2014. The law is a sturdy profession. You can hang out your shingle, and pretty much from day one, you will have people walking through your door ready to hire you. A lot of them, you should tell them to stop. You don't have a case, but you will certainly be able to scrounge up enough of a living to eat for the rest of your life. And maybe even once in a blue moon, you might do some good for the American body politic. All right, guys, I went a bit longer than I thought I would. I apologize about that, but we're still within the 1 hour. I basically am willing to stay here as long as you want if you have any questions about law school or the process. Any questions? Come on, not even one? Yes, Dr. Harrison. It's never too late.
Exactly.
There were some.
I'm going for now.
I had a girl, Alicia, who was in my class. I think she was 45. She worked as an insurance agent for years. Saved up her money, didn't have to pay. She was able to pay it and just write a check for each year, and she graduated. So you can go.
Do law schools have student housing, or do you live off campus, or does it depend on the law school?
Depends.
Okay.
Some schools do have student housing, especially if they have an undergraduate campus. But I know when I was at Wake Forest, for example, a few of them decided to be RAs, and that would cover your residency. But 99% of law students live on off-campus housing, unless you decide to somehow squeak in and sleep in one of the library carrels for 3 years. But absent that, you will be living off campus. I lived in an off-campus apartment. It was owned by the university, but it was off campus. I say that with a qualification. I'm sure there are some schools where they do have housing, but that's the exception rather than the norm. Yes.
Tell them about your commute, and then tell them about that time you wrecked your body.
Oh, yes. So
we need to hear more stories from Nathan here.
Yeah. That's what I got the good.
So much like with undergrad, parking can be a real pain in the rear end. And I lived at 149 Rosedale Circle in Winston-Salem, which was maybe like a quarter, maybe a third of a mile to school each way. And I would commute on my bicycle every day. And people were really mean when they're driving. I would ride on the sidewalk because people drive like idiots. I would occasionally have people throw like McDonald's. Sorry, 1 second, folks. People would throw McDonald's sweet teas at me. And I mean, you know, I had all sorts of things. I had people occasionally. I mean, there was one time I was crossing the sidewalk and the woman, she had her iPod, earphones in, just turned right, cut right in front of me. And one time I did wreck and nearly broke my wrist, but luckily I managed to walk away from that more or less, except for my pride, unharmed and a torn shirt. So, any other questions? Surely there's at least one question. I noticed you've taken notes throughout all this. Is there anything that jumps out at you? Have I been so thorough you do not have a single question?
I'm more here for like getting in, you know, getting in is the first animal I want to tackle. And you pretty much did everything that like I wanted to know about the process.
Okay, well,
I don't
wonderful.
really have it, like I want to get through this before I get into like what it's going to be like.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I will tell you, usually when you apply, there's a waiting period after you submit your application. So if you apply, don't think it's like renewing your license at the DMV where, okay, hey, 5 minutes later, I'm good to go. You will usually have probably at least a month where you have to wait. Now, I'll also tell you when it comes to that scholarship money, if they don't give you a good enough number, I'm not saying barge into the admissions office and slap them across the face. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. But there's nothing wrong with you saying, hey, this other school gave me $25,000. You only gave me 20. Can you match it? They're ranked higher than you, or they're ranked approximately the same. They're in the same tier. Can you do better? That's perfectly fine. One other issue I should bring up, this has come up once or twice in the course of my academic career. If you have a criminal record, let's talk about that for a second. There is actually a fellow who was in the news because he was a bank robber. He got addicted to drugs and started robbing banks and did about 5 years in the federal penitentiary. Well, he practiced con law, basically. I don't mean constitutional law. He was a jailhouse lawyer. It was pretty good. He helped one of his companions in prison write a legal brief that made its way up to a circuit court of appeals. And I think it even was reviewed by the Supreme Court at one point. And once he made parole, he applied for law school. He got letters of recommendation from the prosecutor, the warden, from the judge who sentenced him to prison. And he ended up, if I remember, I forget what school he went to. I want to say it was Harvard. Now, it also helped he did very well in the LSAT. But he was admitted, he got a Supreme Court clerkship, and he ended up getting hired as a tenured professor at George Mason. And then just a couple of days ago, he was arrested for repeatedly beating his wife. So it was really a really good redemption story until that last minute, you know. Now, you're innocent until proven guilty. You know that as a lawyer. But I say all of that. That's his decision. That's his character flaw. Point being, even that guy was able to get into law school. This guy did time in the federal penitentiary for bank robbery. There was another fellow who was admitted to Tulane University after he committed murder. It was either Tulane or Temple. I believe it was Tulane, though. He's going to have a hard time ever being barred because I think the character and fitness will give him grief. But
So murder's not good.
yeah, probably not. There may be some state. I think Washington has admitted there are a few states, including West Virginia, where even if you're a convicted felon, you can still practice law. But those are becoming more and more rare. But let's say, for example, you have a traffic ticket or a parking ticket. I got one yesterday. Don't worry about that. That's not a big deal. Kind of mad at the campus police for charging me $10, but that isn't going to stop you from going to law school. You get a speeding ticket. I was admitted to law school and I got a speeding ticket a few weeks before I started, and I was freaking out. I was like, oh God, they're going to kick me out. No, they're not. Literally, they just throw it in the file just to make sure you just let them know. You have something more serious, a DUI or a public intox, maybe even a drug possession. As long as you're open about it and say, look, this is my mistake. The student I alluded to who paid out of pocket because she was in her 40s, right before the bar exam, she got a DUI. She was still admitted. I'm sure she had a few more awkward questions before character and fitness, but as long as you say, look, this was an aberration, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. If you're truly penitent, if you take the time to show, look, this was years ago, or look, yes, it was recent, but I'm sorry, here are the circumstances, usually people are understanding because we're all fallen sinners. We all make mistakes, and none of us are perfect. And as long as you recognize and you're penitent for your mistakes, usually that won't be a huge impediment, especially if you've already applied and been admitted. Okay? Any other questions? But no, do not commit murder. So, yes.
What can you tell us about like, the actual experience of law school? What's the look like? What workload there? Classes? What's that experience?
Okay, that's a great question. Your schedule will be laid out for you that first year. If I remember correctly, it's a 90-hour course of study at Wake Forest. Here in undergrad, it's 120 as it is in most universities. But it's a very intense amount of time. I'll give you an example. I had Michael Kent Curtis as my constitutional law professor for Con Law 1 and Con Law 2. It was not uncommon for him to give you 100 pages of reading in a night. I would tell you at a minimum, you should expect in any class that you're taking. If you have class the next day, you're probably going to get at least 20 pages of reading for that class. You'll have what's known as a case book, which is this big, thick volume you could use as a weapon to defend yourself. I mean, these things are Lawrence Tribe, who wrote the definitive American constitutional law book. His book is 1,300 pages long, single-spaced. I won't say you'll read that entire book if you're at Harvard Law, but you'll read a substantial portion of it. Luckily, compared to prior decades, there's no realistically human way you could read that many pages per night for 3 years without getting burnout. Even your first year, you would get burnout. They do have a lot of what I would really call the equivalent of cliff notes. You have what are known as horn books that explain the law. There's, for example, bar prep materials that I recommend students buy beforehand, the Barbary Convisor Mini Review. Or, of course, nowadays with Wikipedia, Quimby, case briefs, or even the head notes on these cases, they allow you to get the meat of the legal arguments, even if you don't know it sentence by sentence. The other thing that helps you is if you buy a used case book, because other students will have annotated it before you, and hopefully they weren't a complete dunce, so they'll have picked out the important parts of the case. Sometimes you will get the dunce, though. You have to accept that. So caveat emptor. So also, I would tell you, your schedule your first year is pretty reasonable. It's mostly going to be 9 to 3, 9 to 4. You're not going to see 8 a.m. or 7 p.m. courses, but as you go further along, that may become more common. Usually, you can expect in a given semester, you'll probably take 4 or 5 courses. There will be certain mandatory courses you'll take in law school: contracts, constitutional law, civil procedure, evidence. You'll probably have legal writing your first semester. Other courses that I would encourage you to consider taking: family law, secure transactions, alternative dispute resolution, wills, trusts, and estates, property. And then, of course, you have some more niche ones, coal, oil, and gas. That would be a great one if you're coming back to West Virginia. Admiralty law is another interesting one I took. But you have a wide variety. But I would tell you expect 4 or 5 classes your first semester. It will be very intense. Also, there will be a lot of competition. I hate to say it's cutthroat, but there is definitely some rivalry. The last thing I should mention about law school is they do something called the Socratic method. If any of you haven't seen the old movie, The Paper Chase, it involves a professor named Professor Kingsfield. And he, for example, the first day of class at law school at Harvard Law, calls the protagonist of this book and movie and asks him to stand up and requires him to recite the details of Kemper v. Hawkins, which is known as the hairy hand case. Basically, a boy burns his hand, and the surgeon promises the parents, we'll do a skin graft, it'll be a perfectly good hand. While he transplants skin from the boy's chest, which is fine when the boy's 11 or 12, but when he hits puberty, those hair follicles are still there, and his hand becomes very hairy when he's like 14, 15 years old. And they ask him to recite the facts of that case, and the protagonist says, well, I don't really know. He says, well, then why are you at law school? And choose them out. That is basically passed. It was also common in the old days to say, look to your left, look to your right. One of you 3 will not be here at the end of the semester. There used to be a very high dropout rate. That is no longer the case. If you enter law school, 90+% of you will graduate. I think I had about 180 in my class. You had 2 or 3 that dropped out the first month of class. Then you had 1 or 2 at the end of the first semester, then another 1 or 2 at the end of your second semester, at the end of the first year. But I remember after the second year, we had a single girl drop out, and that was so bizarre that it actually was a subject of a little bit of gossip. And then after that, again, no one drops out. Almost no one drops out your second or third year. But it can be a little cutthroat. And with the Socratic method, what they say to you is okay, what are the facts of the case? What's the main holding? What's the key decision? How did the case turn out? And you have to explain the case back to the professor. Some schools are moving away from that and starting to switch to a lecture format like you see in undergrad. I'm actually more in favor of that. I don't particularly care for the Socratic method. I don't think it's the best way to teach law students. But that is still the majority role in the vast majority of law schools. Any other questions, guys? Nothing else? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions online. So again, I thank you all for coming today. If you feel like you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me and send me an email. Or schedule a time to meet with me. I'd be glad to talk with you further. But in the meantime, good luck to all of you with the LSAT and good luck with your law school applications. Take care now.